Over the past few weeks, tensions between the United States and Iran have quietly but significantly escalated. According to most geopolitical risk analysts and think tanks, we are now in a phase where the risk of US military action against Iran is no longer hypothetical. It is increasingly central to global markets and geopolitics. Today, I want to walk you through what the US is demanding from Iran, why a deal is likely to fail, what military options are realistically on the table, and why a strike, while risky, is being taken seriously in Washington. I'll also explain why oil markets are watching this so closely, and why some options, like an oil blockade, may sound dramatic but actually make little strategic sense. Let's start with the big picture. The US is pushing Iran toward an expansive, all-or-nothing deal. This isn't a narrow nuclear agreement like the original JCPOA. Washington is demanding that Iran give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, suspend uranium enrichment indefinitely, end support for regional proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, accept limits on its ballistic missile program. From Iran's perspective, this is close to a demand for strategic surrender. Iranian leaders may be willing to offer limited concessions to avoid war. For example, temporary nuclear restraints or symbolic steps on enrichment. But President Trump has resisted limited deals throughout his term. Given Iran's weakened regional position and the US's stronger leverage, there's little indication Washington would accept a partial compromise now. That's why analysts increasingly believe diplomacy is likely to fail, and why the probability of military action has risen sharply, in some estimates to around 70%. Importantly, this isn't just rhetoric. Most of the US military assets required for a strike are already in place or can be activated quickly. That's why analysts believe that if diplomacy collapses, action could come as early as February and is increasingly likely before late April. This doesn't mean a strike is inevitable, but it does mean the US is positioning itself so that if a political decision is made, execution can happen fast. So what kind of strike are we actually talking about? One option that's being discussed is what analysts call a Venezuela-style decapitation strike. In simple terms, this would involve a one-off operation aimed at killing Iran's Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, simultaneous strikes on missile infrastructure and remaining nuclear facilities. The logic is stark but strategic. By eliminating Khamenei, the US would remove what it sees as the main obstacle to diplomacy, while also delivering a dramatic demonstration of American power. At the same time, striking missile and nuclear targets would limit Iran's ability to retaliate effectively. Crucially, this could be framed as a limited action, not regime change. Just as in Venezuela, the US could quietly signal through back channels that it does not seek the collapse of the Iranian system, and is willing to engage with a post-Khamenei leadership. From Washington's perspective, this is an attempt to shock the system without blowing it up entirely. So what happens inside Iran if Khamenei is killed? Now, this is where things get complicated. There is no question that killing the Supreme Leader would be a massive shock to Iran's political system. Hardliners would demand retaliation, and the regime would face intense internal pressure to respond forcefully. However, some analysts believe that the leadership group that would likely emerge immediately after Khamenei's death, dominated by pragmatic conservatives in the Supreme National Security Council and senior IRGC commanders, would prioritize regime survival above all else. That means retaliation, yes, but retaliation calibrated to avoid triggering an all-out war with the United States. In this scenario, Iran might launch missile strikes on US bases or naval assets in the Persian Gulf, demonstrate resolve without crossing escalation thresholds that would force massive US retaliation. The idea is to absorb the shock, preserve the system, and live to fight another day politically. Why this strategy is extremely risky? But this strategy comes with enormous risks. First, Khamenei is extremely well protected and elusive. Locating him in real time and executing a successful strike would require near-perfect intelligence. A failed or partial strike would be far worse than no strike at all. Second, even if Iranian leaders want to show restraint, Khamenei's status as both a political and religious figure means that limited retaliation may not be enough. The regime would face credibility problems domestically and across the Shia world if it failed to respond forcefully. That retaliation could include large-scale missile launches at U.S. bases, attacks on U.S. naval vessels, proxy actions that are difficult to control. There's also a serious risk of miscalculation. Even limited strikes could cause U.S. casualties, forcing Trump to escalate further, whether he wants to or not. And if U.S. strikes accidentally kill other senior leaders or disrupt Iran's internal power balance, the hoped-for pragmatic transition may not happen at all. In that case, hardliners could seize control, leading to a far more aggressive and unpredictable response. If U.S. planners decide that killing Khamenei is too risky or impractical, the most likely fallback option is targeted strikes on Iran's missile and nuclear infrastructure. That would mean hitting missile bases, production facilities, and launchers, striking remaining nuclear facilities to delay any rebuilding of the program. This approach is less dramatic, but it still carries retaliation risks. Iran would almost certainly respond against U.S. bases and ships, and potentially against regional allies. Iran has also warned that Israel would be a target in the event of a U.S.-led attack. If Iranian strikes caused significant civilian casualties in Israel, Israel would be compelled to respond, increasing the risk of a wider regional conflict even if it remains contained as it was during the exchanges in mid-2025. Finally, let's talk about oil. Some observers suggest the U.S. could try to block Iranian oil exports. In reality, this is one of the least attractive options. A full blockade would almost certainly provoke Iran into disrupting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. That would send oil prices sharply higher, potentially above $80 per barrel or more, with global economic consequences. Even a partial blockade wouldn't work quickly. Iran relies on oil revenue, but cutting that revenue takes time to have political impact. In the meantime, Iran's retaliation would hit markets immediately. From a cost-benefit perspective, blockades deliver few near-term gains and massive risks, which is why they're generally viewed as a last resort. To sum up, the U.S. is pushing Iran toward an expansive deal that is unlikely to succeed. The risk of military action has risen sharply, but outcomes remain uncertain. A decapitation strike on Khamenei is being discussed, but it carries extreme risks. Missile and nuclear strikes are a more conservative fallback. Oil markets are pricing containment, but remain vulnerable to escalation. This is one of those moments where markets, geopolitics, and military strategy intersect and where small miscalculations could have outsized consequences. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know, and we can dive deeper into what this means for oil, gas, and global markets next.